Thank you. No, thank you for that nice introduction. Appreciate it. And thank you. I want to just thank Dr. Belko for working with her on this. I think over a year ago she came to me and we had lots of discussions about how to plan out this series, and so I'm really grateful that she invited me to be a speaker in this series and to see it come to fruition. Well, as the introduction noted, the title that I was given, Equity and Representation in Policymaking. There are many ways we can go with this title, but what I really want to do in this talk today is talk a little bit about the concept of representation and what it means. I'm not a political philosopher, but a lot of political philosophers have written a lot about this concept. What does it mean to be represented? Most of my work, of course, is empirical, which is meaning that I study sort of the way things are, not the way things ought to be. And so today what I want to do is talk a little bit about minority representation in particular. As was mentioned, I've done most of my work on Latino representation, so you're going to hear a lot referring to that. But I want to sort of branch it out and make it a little bit more open. And then I'm going to say a little bit about judicial representation, because there's not a lot of work on this subject, but I think it's equally important. Not just so much representation in Congress and in state legislatures, but in the judiciary. And I want to show you some data there and give you some ideas about that. All right, so there are some major questions in the study of political representation that I see in the literature. So the first one I want to think about is, what is the state of representation in the United States? And I'll define this term in a second, because we kind of know what it is, right? What is representation? How can we measure it? So representation is one of those things that, yes, I kind of know what you're talking about, but how would we define it? And so I'll get to that in a second. And then the next idea is sort of, how do we measure it, right? We kind of know sometimes when you're well represented or you're poorly represented, but what are some tangible ways in which we can think about how to measure those concepts, rather than just sort of an impression about whether someone is well represented or poorly represented? And then I want to sort of delve in and kind of ask you to think a little bit about this literature on the question of what we call descriptive representation. That is to say, does it matter if you have representatives from your own group? And if it does, how does it matter, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about that sort of debate about minority representation in particular, and is it important for Blacks to have Black representatives or Latinos to have Latino representatives, and so on, right? Because we can think of a lot of different groups in our society. And so to what extent does this matter? And then I want to talk a little bit about sort of the empirical, which is what I do. What factors have affected the number of non-white legislators elected, not only to state legislatures, but Congress and other institutions? And how have institutions responded to increased representation, right? And also access to the ballot. So I'm going to say a little bit about voting rights. I think I have a lot on my plate today, so hopefully you'll bear with me, but I think it's good to be broad here in this type of presentation. I think this is the last question. What role have courts and judges played in shaping representation? And this is where I want to pivot and talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Act, which was, of course, a piece of congressional legislation. But the way the Voting Rights Act has been implemented has been largely driven by the courts, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about some of those key cases. And by the way, if anyone has questions while I'm talking, feel free to ask if there's something that's not clear or you want more clarification. And I'll try to give you some time for questions at the end as well. All right, so the first thing, what is representation? In the literal sense, it's just standing in place for others, right? If we think about American democracy, that's what we have, a representative democracy. And so it's a democracy in which we elect representatives, right, to represent us. What did I do? Let's see. Okay, here we go. So practically in the political system, right, it's someone who advocates on your behalf, with the national or state or county governments, right, because we have representation not only at the state level, but also at the local level. And it can include a lot of things, right? Introducing legislation, voting, right? Town hall meetings, lobbyists, lobbying, community affairs, community relations. But in order to elect representatives and basically be represented, right, you have to be able to vote, right? So voting is an essential element here. And when we think about representation, it's important to think about it in a more nuanced way, right? And many theorists have thought about representation by first examining representation in a way that's substantive or substantive. And what we mean by that basically is when we elect someone to represent us, we're electing them to represent our interest, right? And that kind of, it seems obvious, right? But it should be kind of spelled out more clearly. You're representing someone to represent your interests. So if you have positions on views, on a variety of different views, you want someone to basically represent you on those views in Congress or whatever legislative body. But another important aspect of representation, which I've alluded to earlier, is descriptive representation. That is, having someone who shares some demographic characteristics with you. So things like race, ethnicity, and gender, right? The idea that if you're African American, having someone who's also African American represent you. Or if you're Latino, having someone who is Latino represent you. And as we talk about these ideas of representation are not mutually exclusive, right? One can be substantively represented and not descriptively represented, right? And one can be descriptively represented but not substantively represented. So there's a big debate about these two concepts, and in particular, to what extent does descriptive representation matter? Very few people argue that substantive representation shouldn't matter. I mean, obviously that's the heart of it, right? But to what extent does descriptive representation matter? Okay, and I'll say a bit about that in a second. Because many scholars have argued that what really matters is substantive representation, that as long as your interests are represented, it doesn't matter the race or ethnicity of the person who's representing you, right? However, there's been a lot of debate about this, and some argue that there are benefits of descriptive representation. And we can divide them into primary benefits, right, and secondary or down the road. So the election of minority group members to Congress can yield more substantive representation. And there is this analogy, right, of having sort of a seat at the table, right? And we think about the lawmaking and we think about Congress, right, having kind of this proverbial, well, it's not really proverbial, it's a literal seat at the table, right? There's an old joke that if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're on the menu, right? So you don't want to be on the menu. And so the question is, has it mattered historically, and I'll talk about the progression of this, more minorities getting elected to Congress and state legislatures, has that made a difference, right? Has the presence of these individuals in those legislative bodies made a difference in the agenda that's being set, and in the policy outcomes that are occurring, right? Another, I would call them secondary benefits of descriptive representation, and this is an important one, is that of trust, right? There is, and we have shown, there's evidence of this in the literature, that minorities tend to trust members of their own ethnic or racial group. And they're even more likely to contact them. So let's say you live in a district that's represented by someone, let's say you're African American and your representative is white, yet the neighboring district has an African American representative. That constituent is more likely to contact the African American representative, even though he doesn't live in the same district, right? And so that's what we get, and part of, I think, what's driving this is trust, right? This element of trust. And it could also lead to increased engagement or activity. This simple idea, right, that there's an empowerment effect, that by seeing someone get elected, whether it's the first mayor or the first legislator or something like that, that it empowers those groups, right, to go out and vote, especially groups that have historically had low levels of participation, that by having someone in office who looks like them, it empowers them. And that the substance of legislation can also change when there are individuals who are in those communities that are in legislative office. They may be more familiar with issues that affect their communities and are more likely to introduce legislation to affect those ideas. And so those are just some other aspects there. But if we look at descriptive representation in the current Congress, 75% of Congress is non-Hispanic white, even though the population is about 59% non-Hispanic white. Now, so there is this sort of discrepancy, right? You have in Congress kind of an over-representation of non-Hispanic white. And of course, there are a lot of historical reasons for that. And if you look at 1981, just to kind of take the data and see how it's changed, in 1981, 94% of Congress members were non-Hispanic white, and even though 80% of the population was non-Hispanic white. So you've seen since 1981, right, the non-Hispanic white population decrease to 59%. And you've also seen from 94 to 75%. But there's still a gap, right? And the idea here is that there is a gap between the percentage in the population and the percentage in Congress. Now, if you look at the current Congress, if you look at minorities, which mean African American, Latino, or Asian American, Native American as well, 80% of minority members of Congress, that's what MC stands for, are Democrats, and 20% are Republican. And I'll say a little bit more about sort of the Republican numbers have gone up, right? So if we look at 20%, yeah, you see it and it is fairly low, but it's much higher than it was 10, 20 years ago, which was even lower than that, 15, 10%. So why such a limited number of non-white representatives? Well, obviously, when it comes to African Americans, there's a history of voter disenfranchisement, right, and voter suppression, which is why the Voting Rights Act, of course, was signed into law in 1965. But there's also an issue of limited recruitment of candidates of color by the political parties to run as candidates. So recruitment is something that has to sort of step up as well. And historically, it was harder for primarily white districts to elect candidates of color, although that's changing, right? And we see some examples of candidates of color getting elected to, white districts. But the most successful candidates have political experience, they have lots of money, right, and support from political parties. And candidates of color have often lacked these resources, right? And so the kinds of things that predict electoral success, money, support from political parties, and so on, tend to be in lower supply, right, for African American and Latinos in particular. So the question is this something we should care about, right? Why care about the representation of minorities? When will there be a critical mass, in other words? This critical mass that will help minorities have their substantive interests represented, and to get this sort of sense of empowerment, right, that I was talking about earlier. Because we're very far off from parity in Congress and the actual population. So parity, if we look at the Latino population, which is about 17 or 18% nationwide, that would yield roughly about 74 Latino House members, which is not what exists, right? Currently it's about 38 or something. So we're way under this amount now with numbers ranging from the mid-20s to low 30s. And of course there's a steady increase there, but still not at parity. And so as I talked about representation, and I kind of alluded to this link between substantive and descriptive representation, I've done a lot of research here with others who have found ample evidence that members of minority groups kind of have historically needed descriptive representation in order to yield the most substantive representation. So the way this has been translated was that Latinos need Latino representatives to have their interests served, same with other groups, right? And that's historically been the case, right? Is that still the case, right? Or is this not necessary anymore? And that's something I can come back to later and talk about, and I'm curious to hear your opinions about it. But the last thing I want to say is this does not mean that descriptive representation always leads to better substantive representation for minority groups, right? So it's not a necessary, doesn't follow necessarily, right? Another thing to keep in mind here is that if you insist, for example, that only Latinos can represent Latinos or only blacks can represent blacks, I'm not saying that, and I don't want to suggest that, because that would imply that, for example, that they couldn't represent whites, right? Blacks couldn't represent whites or Latinos couldn't represent whites, and that's not the case, obviously. So in terms of evaluating minority representation and elections, the literature contends that descriptive representation is necessary for this maximum level of substantive representation. There's been a lot of research on intersectionality as well and how that matters for Latino and black representation. That is, A lot of the literature in politics looks at women's representation and minority representation separately, and kind of assumes that when we talk about women in politics or women in office, that it's sort of monolithic, that white women and black women sort of behave similarly or vote similarly. And the idea here is that you should look at black women and white women separately, right? Because you have different ways of how they interpret themselves in office, right? And how they view themselves. And so we should be very careful about that. In some work I found, Latinos are more likely to get elected in places with obviously high Latino populations, which makes sense. But then also the type of institution matters. So when you look at state legislatures, in Texas we have a citizen legislature. It meets once every 2 years. They're currently meeting, right, until May. And after that, they don't meet for another 2 years. Those professionalized legislatures meet year-round, right? And what I found is that these kind of legislatures like Texas, less professionalized, there's tend to be more turnover in office, right? Because Texas legislators get paid, I think, $7,000 a year or something like this, right? So there's more turnover, and when you have more turnover, political newcomers, like many Latinos, are more likely to get into office, right? Because it opens up seats from entrenched incumbents. I want to shift briefly and talk a little bit about the racial diversification on the federal bench in particular. I've done some recent research looking at representation, in particular Latino judges on the federal district courts. And this chart you can see back from Roosevelt all the way, it stops at the Trump administration. But the main purpose of this chart is to show that despite these significant efforts to close this qualification gap for racial minorities, there is a disparity in terms of even the appointments by presidents of judges on the basis of race ethnicity, such that if you look here, the percentage of, these are all federal district court judges, right? And you can look here, the population, the US population in terms of racial and ethnic minorities, right? So it peaks here at about just under 40% in 2018. And then the percentage of judges appointed by that president, right? And so what you can see has been kind of a little bit of an increase during the Clinton administration, right? With a significant number, but still under the percentage. And then during the Bush administration, it dropped. So he appointed fewer judges who were black or Latino or Asian American. And then the Obama administration, they made an effort to diversify the federal judiciary, so that's why it's higher here. And then during the Trump administration, it went back down significantly in terms of his appointment of minority federal judges, which is very low, right? And in a paper I wrote with one of my former graduate students, Scott Hofer, we found actually that Latino federal judges were actually more conservative in many ways than white federal judges, at least the ones who were appointed in recent years. So that if Trump really wanted a federal judiciary that was more conservative, he should have appointed more Latino judges. So, but he didn't, and so we can talk about that. But if the racial makeup of the federal judiciary, if you just look at Latino and black judges, it's been historically extremely low, right? And often we just look at the elective offices, but I think it's very important to think about the federal judiciary and the extent to which presidents have either appointed judges from minority communities or not, right? We've only had 3 non-white Supreme Court justices this past 1967, right? Of course, the most famous, the Latina judge, of course, Sonia Sotomayor, who was appointed by President Obama. And in 2001, she delivers a very controversial speech called the Latina Judge's Voice, where kind of, I think the famous quote here during the 2001 hearing was, "Whether born from experience or inherent physiological or cultural differences, our gender and national origins may and will make a difference in our judging," right? And so this is kind of coming back to this idea of representation, right, and descriptive representation. And so her quote indicates, right, that descriptive representation matters not only to how legislators behave, right, but to how judges decide, right? So I think that's the point that she's making, which of course was very controversial during her judicial nomination hearings. And I could talk more about that later, and to think about, in particular, how those ideas about the judiciary and in particular sort of perceptions of the judiciary have radically changed, right, in the past, you can even say 5 or 10 years, where the judiciary has consistently been sort of more trusted, right, more highly regarded, but that's come back down, especially with controversial rulings, like the Dobbs decision being the big one there. But I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit back to voting and talk about what I think is the most important piece of legislation that Congress really passed, in recent history, is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because, it really aimed at outlawing these discriminatory practices that really disenfranchised African Americans in the South. And then later, you can even also argue for other groups like Latinos in Texas and other places. But what's important about this, I want to focus on 3 parts of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 and the pre-clearance provision. Section 203 dealing with multilingual ballots. And then back to how redistricting and the creation of majority-minority districts helped basically show that increase that we saw, right, in the growth of legislators in Congress in particular. So if you look at the VRA, Section 5 basically was most of the old states of the Confederacy, right? Texas was subject to Section 5. And what Section 5 pre-clearance simply was that any changes in redistricting lines had to be approved by the Department of Justice, right, in Washington. That was what Section 5 said, okay? And that had been in effect between 1971, the first time we saw redistricting after the Voting Rights Act, until 2011, right? Because something happened in 2013 that changed that, which I'll say in a few minutes. Section 203, again, the bilingual ballots, we call them bilingual, multilingual. In Harris County, we have multilingual ballots. If more than 5% of a constituency in a county speaks a different language, then ballots in that language must be provided. That's why if you go vote in Harris County, you see ballots in Chinese, Vietnamese, Spanish, and of course in English. The Voting Rights Act, I'll briefly go over this because I want to have a discussion, but it was extended in 1975 to include linguistic minorities, especially there were hearings on techniques of disenfranchisement so that people who didn't speak English were not provided adequate translations, and so this kind of made it more uniform, right, across these different areas. And the bilingual provisions were extended. And sort of the way the Voting Rights Act has been interpreted by the courts has made a huge difference, because one of the early cases dealt with how do you show voter discrimination. And early on, it was the idea that you had to show intent, right? You had to show that people who are doing redistricting intentionally discriminated in their redistricting plans. And of course, we know that's a high burden, right, to show intentional discrimination. And so some later amendments by Congress in 1982 changed that intent to results, right? If a new redistricting plan results in fewer blacks represented or fewer Latinos represented, then that was sufficient to show discrimination, right? And I'll talk about a case in a second in which I can demonstrate that very clearly. It was extended for an additional 25 years. In 2006, bipartisan, right? President Bush signed the renewal. And so the creation of these majority-minority districts happened after the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. Districts were drawn with a majority and minority group members to make it easier to facilitate the election of minorities to office, right? And it was often early on, especially in the 1970s, a necessary condition in order to elect, especially African Americans in the South. Because prior to 1965, there were very few, if any, African Americans elected from the South, even though the South had most states had 35% black populations, right? And so that meant drawing these majority-minority districts. Now, some majority-minority districts, and this is true of all districts, I don't want to kind of point this, but this is called the earmuff district in Chicago, because it kind of looks like an earmuff. And basically, it was created to make a Latino majority district with divided here by an interstate highway, and then you had sort of a black area of town here, and then the Latino area of town surrounding it. and a more controversial 1997 district in North Carolina that kind of went all over the place, right? And so these bizarre shapes began to take place in districting after the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which is why the court started hearing a whole lot of cases about this. And I'm going to briefly go through this. Baker versus Carr and Reynolds versus Sims basically said you have to have one person, one vote. Because prior to 1965, what many states were doing is just creating districts that had lopsided populations, right? And so that's what's one way you can easily disenfranchise voters, by just creating districts with different populations. But after Baker and Reynolds, you can't do that, right? Now, they're not going to be exact, but the districts are going to be more or less similar populations. So that minimizes the ability to disenfranchise, right? Especially by doing it so blatantly with population. The Shaw versus Reno case in 1993 allowed plaintiffs to sue the state of North Carolina on the grounds that they had been discriminated against by these plans that created these majority-minority districts. So there were lawsuits saying that these districts were unconstitutional. And in the decision, which was very controversial with Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, saying that these bizarrely shaped districts are open to challenge, and that districts cannot look the way that these, this bizarre kind of shape, right? That they must avoid what Sandra Day O'Connor called racial apartheid. So these districts with racial majorities can now be narrowly tailored, right? And that's sort of a legal definition for just making sure that it's very, very precise. But I wanted to speed to this one because this is probably the most consequential decision on voting rights in the past 10 years, and that's the Shelby County versus Holder case in 2013, which challenged the constitutionality of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the pre-clearance provision that I talked about, and Section 4B, which was a formula to decide which states were subject to Section 5. So without going into the nitty-gritty of the legal analysis, the point is that the court invalidated Section 4, which was the formula by which Congress decided which states were subject to Section 5, and said it needed to be updated. And so the court ruled here that when this formula was created in 1965, the situation was different than it is today, and so Congress needs to update the formula, right, in order to determine which states should be subject to preclearance. And so what it essentially did was invalidate Section 5 until Congress only one has the ability to update that formula, right? So has Congress updated that formula since 2013? Well, the answer is no, right? And so that means that Section 5 is not in effect. So for the first time since 1970, Texas and other states, especially in the South, did not have to submit their redistricting plans to the Department of Justice for preclearance. And so that's why the 2021 cycle, right, is kind of unique in the sense that the southern states, especially Texas, could basically draw the districts any way they wanted without any concern that the Department of Justice would send them back. And so what we've seen since Shelby is a dramatic increase in poll closures, like polling locations have closed. Just in Texas, and these numbers are probably a little bit different today than they were when I put this together, but 403 polling places have been closed in Texas, 103 in Louisiana, and so on. And so there's been sort of concern about the effect of not having preclearance on minority representation, and how are minorities impacted by fewer polling places, changing voting hours, and voting ID laws. In the last legislative session, Texas immediately passed Senate Bill 1, which was a large overhaul in the state's voting procedures. And they were emboldened to do that because they knew that they didn't have to worry about preclearance. And so that was sort of the elimination of 24-hour voting, the drive-through voting, and other things that occurred in Harris County in particular. It was very targeted towards Harris County. So I'm going to kind of conclude here, and I know I covered a lot of material, but hopefully that gets us talking. Where does this leave minority representation, right? You can think that there are a multitude of benefits of descriptive representatives, right? The kinds that I already highlighted. having a seat at the table, right? An empowerment effect for constituents, right? To give them a sense of that someone like them is serving in office, and that also that the children can aspire to political office, right? And there's also most recent research that indicates Latinos and African Americans also want more descriptive representatives. So when you ask, is this something that you value, right? Something that many value, right? And so that's something that we should probably pay attention to. And that they think they share policy interest as well with members of their own group, right? So there is a perception that there is shared interests or shared group interests. Nevertheless, we do see increasing number of minorities and women, especially at various levels of government. And so we're seeing dramatic demographic change, right, in Texas, obviously, but also in the country. And so there is this sense in which demography is destiny, right, that as the demographics change, that's going to automatically lead to higher levels of representation. And I think that has to be tempered by a lot of the institutional roadblocks that I've already just kind of highlighted, right? That it's not something that's going to happen automatically, right? Yes, it's going to happen. You're going to see this creeping up of numbers, right? But would that creeping up of numbers happen differently, if you didn't have some of those institutional constraints? For example, New Mexico was a state that's about 45% Hispanic, and up until like maybe 5 years ago, there were no Latinos representing them in Congress, right? But that's changed very quickly with all three members, either Latino or American Indian. So, like I said, I think we shouldn't think about this as minorities being totally shut out of the political process, which is not the case, because we've seen a growth in the number of members of minority groups elected to Congress. And if you just look at the last election, you see like this happening in terms of the first Generation Z member and all these kind of things. So you're seeing more and more people elected to Congress from these marginalized groups. But of course, you still don't have parity, right? When you talk about basic ideas of parity. So I thought I had a last slide, but I think that covers it. And sort of open to any questions you have or anything that you want to hear more about. But thank you for listening. Appreciate it. There it is. Okay. Yes.
With the example of the 400 or so polling places that closed down in Texas, would a more equitable approach to making sure that there's plenty of polling places open and 24-hour voting, drive-through voting, would a more equitable legislation have to come at the local level, or would it have to come top down from the federal level?
Well, this is a good question. When we talk about these ideas, voting and the way elections are administered are fundamentally done by the states. So the states are the ones that control all voting procedures. Now, the federal government has sort of the basic in the Constitution, right? The federal elections have to be in the first Tuesday in November and all that. But how the elections are run, right, that's totally up to the states. And localities, basically, states have taken control over the process over localities, and that's certainly the case in Texas, because local governments really only exist at the pleasure of the state anyway, right? And so we've seen this sort of conflict between local governments and the state currently. I think today I just saw that Harris County is going to sue the state, right? So you see this tension between the state, especially in Texas, where you have this sort of Democratic cities and the Republican state government at odds over pretty much everything today. And what we're seeing is more of what we call preemption. So any kind of local control that local governments have had, to the extent that they pose a problem, right, for those in Austin in power, then they're going to be preempted. And we've seen that on pretty much lots of different issues. And so, yes, you have the county, the county administers the elections, right? The Harris County does their administration. But the state can come in and pass a law that changes how they do it, right? Which is what they did in 2021. So, I mean, I guess to answer your question, I mean, it's all about sort of who's in the legislature, right, and who's, who's governor in terms of the kinds of ways in which elections are administered, right? There was some flexibility with the pandemic, and that's why Harris County, did these things like the 24-hour voting and so on, which of course the legislature wanted to try to do away with for any future elections to make the law clearer. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
On the mechanisms of disenfranchisement that I have seen still today, as recent as the midterm elections to state government offices in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed in terms of the majority party in office being conservative, the availability in terms of access to the ballot, availability is far more prominent in the suburbs, more so than more areas where liberal-leaning demographics of individuals are. And I was wondering, in terms of achieving equity and how that manifests into representation on the higher level in Congress and federal hearings, why is the solution not simply adding more voting ballot, like poll locations?
Mm-hmm.
Because I know that that has to do with, accommodating more so of an agenda of interest, whether it may be to one demographic or versus another in terms of what the quota is at the time, but I was wondering the complexity in terms of why not just construct more polls?
Yeah, well, so, I mean, obviously, yeah, this is a good question. I mean, I think when we talk about sort of, the way our voting system is sort of designed, right? In some countries like Australia, voting is compulsory; it's mandatory, right? And so you can get sort of fined if you don't vote. That, of course, is not something that would happen here because there is that idea they have a right to vote but a right not to, right? But I think the big issue here is that the argument is going to be, okay, if we do open up voting and make it more easily accessible and more widely available, the idea is you want to make sure it's secure, right? So you have this perception that there's voter fraud, right? And that voter fraud is widespread and that there needs to be security, right? So that this was the issue with the ballots, right? That the mail-in ballot law was tightened, right? Especially dealing with making sure that you had to provide your driver's license number, that matched the number that you used when you first registered to vote. And that's why a lot of ballots were thrown out in Harris County, because people didn't remember which number they used, and so those ballots were automatically discarded, right? And so, I mean, yeah, you can argue, of course, and this gets back to that issue of intent, right? So what's the intent of these laws? Well, you can argue, on the one hand, the intent is to make sure that our voting systems are secure. That's what, the legislature and the governor says. On the other hand, you could say that the effects of these sort of laws may have disproportionate impacts on particular communities or particular localities, in which case the end result is, making it harder or easier for one party to win elections. But at the end of the day, remember that, especially when we talk about redistricting, whichever party is in control, they're going to try to do everything they can to maintain control, right? So if it benefits them to create more open polling places, then they're going to do that. If it doesn't benefit them, they're not going to do it, right? Now, you can argue whether it's right or wrong, right? That's a whole other issue, but each party is there to try to maintain their power or to gain power, right? And so that's what they're going to do. Yeah, follow up.
In practice, the redrawing of district lines, there is a balancing act of integrity as well as arguably almost prolonging these acts of disenfranchisement depending on what the agenda is at that moment. Is that correct?
Right. I mean, so when we talk, the redistricting process, it's blatantly political, right? That's not in question, right? So, and whoever's in control, they're going to try to create the districts to make sure they retain control, right? You can only do that so much, though, especially if you're talking about states that are more competitive, But there's also a movement to go to independent redistricting commissions, which is what California has, in which case the legislature doesn't draw the districts, but an independent commission does. And so the idea is to try to take the politics out of redistricting. And there's to some extent it works, but it's still mixed. Yeah.
One more thing.
Yeah.
What I find remarkable is
Right.
So it's interesting to see how that works with the cyclic character of politics in terms of what political party we see in office.
Yeah, that's a good point about the Electoral College, because it doesn't have to be winner take all, right? Each state can decide how to allocate its electoral vote. So, like you mentioned, Nebraska, Maine, I think does it this way. So there are a lot of proposals to try to make it so that it's more difficult for the winner of the popular vote not to win the election, but that would require a lot of coordination. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dan?
Can you say just a little bit more about the connection between descriptive and substantive
Mhm.
representation? Just how it manifests itself, like sponsoring laws and that.
Yeah.
And then also, is there evidence that for any kind of enhanced constituency service?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some research that seems to show that, right? That there's more responsiveness to those areas, and also, I mean, and when I talk about how we measure representation, there are a lot of ways in which scholars have tried to do this, because, oftentimes we just look at roll call voting, but that misses a lot. So some folks have looked at sort of where districts are and where offices are in the district. So like, are they putting congressional offices in certain communities, in certain parts of the district? Staffers as well. There's a lot of research on who gets hired in the congressional staff. And so there's some evidence that staffs are more diverse under representatives who are of that same ethnicity or race. That's historically been the case, although that may be happening more and more anyway, right, with other groups. But to the first question, sort of about that link between descriptive and substantive, yeah, I mean, I think the research seems to show, and a lot of times this can be difficult because when you're talking about sort of descriptive representatives, they're more likely to represent those districts that have large populations of their same race or ethnicity, right? And so, yes, they're going to be more representative of those constituents, of those groups, right? But is it because they're of the same race or ethnicity, or is it just a constituent effect, right? And so that's obviously a big challenge to disentangle that. And so that's why we have to look at more than just the roll call votes and whether they vote for the same bills and that kind of thing, but also about sort of constituent service. And that's why they're looking at things like office locations and staff members and congressional speeches is another thing that a lot of scholars are looking at. Bill sponsorships as well, so they're more likely to sponsor bills that deal with particular issues dealing with race or ethnicity. There's something called the Policy Agendas Project, which codes all bills introduced in Congress, and you can see who sponsors which bills depending on the content. So there's a big coding scheme that kind of breaks it down. So you can look at like civil rights type bills that are more likely to be introduced. But getting around that question of, I guess, endogeneity, that question of sort of constituent-driven or descriptive representation driving it. Yeah. I don't know, Dean or Jeff?
Oh,
yeah.
So near the end of what you spoke about, you talked about how the changing demographics may not overcome the headwinds
Right.
Of institutional barriers.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak to the same issue on two other factors, one of which you addressed, which was the degree to which essentially white voters are willing to vote for minority candidates as a means to overcome those institutional barriers, and the willingness and the potential of diversification in partisan voting by minority voters, as we saw to some degree in South Texas.
Right.
Amongst Latino voters.
Right, and so this is, and this gets back at sort of this issue of Texas and how sort of the demographics will not automatically mean Democrats will do better, because that presupposes that voters are static, right, that they don't change. But yeah, I mean,
in particular, also the potential that Latino voters, if they diversify and vote more Republican, that could then trigger additional Latino Republicans.
right, and in fact, that's something that Robert's in the room. We're working on a project looking at. I thought I had a slide. Yeah, I was going to talk about Pasadena, but I didn't. Oh yeah, so this slide I just totally missed. Well, I'll just put it up so we can. Possible strategies for increased finance. I don't know how I just missed this. But anyway, yeah, so what we're seeing, and you also saw that in the presidential level with, if you look at 2016 to 2020, Latino voters went 8% more for Trump than they did for Hillary, right? And so what we're seeing is sort of the idea that when we talk about, especially Latino voters, that it's not an automatic, Democratic vote, right? That it's going to change and it's going to be context specific. So in other parts of the country, like South Florida, it's quite the opposite. If you look at Florida and how in this last midterm election, it was quite different in the sense that it was a really red wave in Florida, right? But then once you got out of Florida, there was no red wave, right? So early in election night, just looking at that the numbers come in, we thought that there would be this red wave, right? And then all of a sudden, it kind of crashed. But I think the idea here is that we're seeing more and more, and this is something I found 10 years ago when I wrote my book on Latino representation, that Republicans in particular were recruiting Latinos to run for office. And then that kind of dissipated a little bit with Trump, right? But I think it's reemerging despite Trump. Where we saw in South Texas, right, Mayra Flores, who didn't win re-election, but nevertheless was able to sort of win a seat, an open seat in South Texas, and the election of another Latina here in South Texas who's a Republican, right? And so the idea here is that it's a good thing that both parties are reaching out, right, to, in particular, Latino voters, and the idea here, which I say here, there should be pressure on Republicans to appeal to racial and ethnic minority groups, which I think they're starting to do, right, with Latinos, and also on Democrats not to take these groups for granted, right, or assume that they're going to automatically vote for them regardless, right? And so I think that's kind of the idea here, that it's not just one or the other, right? And that these things are very dynamic, right? Because we know political parties exist to win elections, right? And if they cease winning elections, they're going to adapt to try to win them. And that's why it's inevitable that Republicans would have to appeal to Latinos, which is what they're starting to do because they know that they need to win elections. Jeff? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, version of the same question.
Yeah.
Is it are Republicans picking up Latino vote because they're recruiting more candidates, or because the underlying preferences on the part of Latino voters?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a little of both. You have a situation in which Latino voters, in particular, there is this perception that our colleague Geronimo Cortina wrote about a long time ago, that our Latinos are Republican but don't know it yet, right? Which was early on in the 80s, what Ronald Reagan was saying. But you also see, I think, some element in which Republicans have moved overall to be a more rural working class type party, right? You're seeing that. And the shift in Latino votes to Republicans are among the rural working class. So in many ways, Latinos are just basically doing what whites who are rural and lower working class doing. And that's what in South Texas, right? So many are gun owners, many have this sort of rural lifestyle, there's rural consciousness, as we call it. And if you look at Texas, look at those rural counties and the urban counties, you're seeing more and more of that polarization. 90%, for Abbott in the last election, and that's happening with Latinos and whites in those South Texas counties. It's not happening with Latinos in the cities, right? And I think it has a lot to do with the environment you live in, that rural environment, which is sort of church-going, gun-owning, religious, right? I think that matters. And as they perceive the Democratic Party to not embrace those values, those people in those communities are going to shift. So, thank you. Thank you.